Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our first PDI. So here we finally have our Professor Tristan Pooley joining us. Thank you so much. I know we just arrived at the airport and come straight here. So please join me to warmly welcome Professor Tristan Pooley. Now, just a little bit of introduction. So Tristan is an internationally renowned expert in career guidance. He is professor at the Inland Norway University of Applied Science and at the International Center of Guidance Studies at the University of Derby. He has written 10 books, over 60 articles and book chapters, and 100 reports. His latest book is the Oxford Handbook of Career Development, published by the Oxford University Press. He's also visiting professor at Canterbury Christ Church University, a director of NICEC, a Winston Churchill Fellow, and an editor of the Career Guidance and Social Justice website. He is chair of Advisa and on the board of the Career Development Policy Group and the International Center for Career Development and Public Policy. So Tristan, over to you to our session, Career Development for Social Justice.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. I've had a quite troubled journey from London. Yesterday, maybe the day before. It's difficult to tell. I'm now here, and I just got off the plane about an hour ago and came straight here. So if I fall over halfway through, then you'll have to give me a break, really. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a strand of work that I've been working on, which we've described as career development for social justice, or a social justice perspective on career guidance. And what we're going to be thinking about today is, well, first I'm going to try and explain what this is, and then we're going to think about some of its practical implications. So I'm going to try and finish off today with some ideas for practice, really. So, and I've got some activities, I've got some time for you to talk, try and get some breakout rooms going. We've got some people in the room, we've got people online, so I'll try and we'll see how it goes, really. So hopefully it's going to go well. So I think the first thing to admit is that what I'm going to present to you today is sort of not all my own work. I've particularly been working on this project with my two lovely colleagues there who were very cruelly without me in Copenhagen, but you've got Ria Thompson, who's at the University in Denmark, and then you've got Ronald Sultana, who is at the University. And as you heard, I live in the UK. I work at a university called the University of Derby, and also have a role in Norway. So it was a very European project we started. So we started to meet conferences, we started to talk about things, we started to realize we had some similar ideas, and then we decided to do 2 books. We did some things as well. Our list of all the publications that might be useful to you in this at the end of this presentation, so you don't need to kind of catch everything I say. And also I'll put the slides, make the slides available as well, so anything that's of interest you can pick up later as well. But the main sort of 2 books we did one called Career Guidance for Justice, we did one called Career Guidance for Emancipation. And both of those books were collections, and we got lots of other people to write in them as well. And one of the things we tried to do was to get people from all around the world, and we, didn't from Kazakhstan to that. We did have people from Asia and so on. A range of different perspectives in this. And what I'm going to try and draw together some of the ideas that come out of this and talk about them. What are we going to start off with this idea of guidance? What is career guidance? And that's the term. I know probably here people will usually career development. I'll give you my definition of career guidance, and you can see if it's exactly the same thing or something slightly different. But I think it's basically the same thing. But in the UK, we tend to talk about it as career guidance. In Europe, they often call it lifelong guidance, which is an important part of it. It's not just for young people. It's not just the K to 12 bit we're talking about. We're talking about something that goes across people's whole life. So we're going to start by doing that. We're going to then think about what is the idea of justice and injustice, social justice. What do we mean by that? And then we're going to think about what can you do about it. It's all very well justice and injustice to say what's wrong in the world, but if we can't do anything about it, there's not a lot of point in spending a lot of time worrying about it. So what I'm going to argue is that career guidance is actually a powerful tool for helping people to think about their lives and to also change the world that they live in. So that's what we cover. We've got about 2 hours, so we'll finish. Please, will go with me. I won't be talking all the time. I'll give you some chances to talk as we go along. So let's start off with this in career guidance. So what is career guidance? Well, we think about it a bit more, but at heart, I think career guidance is we organize some kind of educational, counseling, or labor market intervention, work with someone, and we try and help them to achieve more than they could have done alone. That's what we're doing when we're doing career guidance. So we're giving people a push up, helping them up, and so on. But if we look at this picture here, we'll notice it's not just, if career guidance is finger pushing low, that's helping people. People are also being helped by their friends, by their family, by the people around them. So when we're doing career guidance, we're helping people to achieve more than they otherwise could have done. But we're also hopefully to access some of the support that's out there in the rest of their life. And that's what we're going to return to. So in the book that we wrote, we tried to come up with a definition. So I'm going to read this out to you. So we say career guidance supports individuals and groups to discover more about work, leisure, and learning, and to consider their place in the world and plan for their future. Career guidance can take a wide range of forms, and it draws on diverse theoretical traditions. But at its heart, it's a purposeful learning opportunity which supports individuals and groups to consider and reconsider work, leisure, and learning in the light of new information and experiences, and to take both individual and collective action as a result of this. And a few things there. If you're an aficionado of career guidance, and you spend a lot of time arguing with people about what career guidance really is and what it isn't and what it means, you'll notice that this definition is quite derivative of a number of others. So if you've seen the OECD definition, if you've seen the European definition, it's kind of similar to this, but we've done a few things slightly differently. The first thing we've done is we've said career guidance is not just about work. Our lives are not just work. We don't live only by going to work. We also have leisure time, we have learning, we have a wider life. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in this social justice perspective is to celebrate the fact that our careers are wider than just work. Of course, work is important. Work is at the center of our lives for most of us, or for many of us. But other things are important as well. And so the first thing we want, when we're doing career guidance with people, we're helping them to balance all of these elements of their life. What we've done in this definition is it's about individuals and groups. So a lot of career guidance has been criticized for focusing on individuals, only on individuals, and not focusing on groups. So my colleague Ria Thompson, who helped me write this, she has a book called Career Guidance in Communities. And she writes about how we don't just pursue our careers alone, we pursue it along with other people. We do it in a community. And career guidance, therefore, has to try and work with the community as a whole, not just with the individual, but to try and activate the community, to help individuals to succeed, but also potentially to help the community to succeed. And then we talk about how the career guidance is done. Well, if I went out to just an ordinary person in the street, live, and I talked about career guidance with them, they probably think I was a bit strange, but they would then say, if they had any idea in their mind of what career guidance is, they'd probably think of it as a counseling, a one-to-one arrangement. You sit down, someone else sits down, you talk about things, you perhaps come out with some sort of action plan at the end. But what we're saying here, and what a lot of other definitions of career guidance also say, is no, career guidance is broader than that. It's got lots of different techniques. Yes, it's about one-to-one counseling. Yes, it's about information provision and so on. And yes, but it's also about things you do in classrooms with groups of people. It's also about experiential learning and so on. And we'll get to that in detail as we go through. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about career guidance. And there's a very useful typology of career guidance activities, which in the UK back a long while ago in the 80s and 90s. And what they said in this typology was, want to define what career guidance is. Many different things. It broke them down. So I'll just go through these with you. So the first thing is giving people information. So we can achieve a lot just by giving them information that they don't know already, or even actually help them figure out what information might be useful to them. And then we might be doing some advising in some places. So people might come to us and say, where should I look for this? What do you think about this? Where do I go for this information? What qualifications do I need if I want to go into this profession? So another activity that we can be doing is advising people. And then we might get to the counseling side, where we're deeper, a bit more sophisticated. We're not just answering people's questions. We're asking people to think deeply. We're asking them to reflect on things. We're perhaps challenging some of their assumptions about their life, about what they're doing, what they think, what they believe. Them to use those deeper questions to figure out who they are and what they want to do in the world. Also doing some assessment. So we might be doing using psychometric assessments or career assessments to give people some insights into themselves. We might also be using various forms of assessment in learning as well, to try and understand what people are good at and what they're not so good at, and help them to reflect on that and develop from that. We'll be certainly educating people. It can take place on a one-to-one, or in many countries, education of the school system, sometimes as part of the university system. Enabling people, so we might be supporting people, encouraging them, helping them to think about what to do with their life, and giving them and help to develop their life in the way they want to. So that might be about giving them structures, asking them to think about what they need to do, setting them goals, those kinds of things. So that's the sort of enabling. And then we might also go out and advocate for somebody. So perhaps we've got a client we're working with, and they're very, very shy. They can't go and they can't talk to perhaps the school principal or to somebody in the benefits office. And so a legitimate activity of career guidance is to go and represent them, to talk on their behalf. Now, hopefully we want to do that in a way that's also enabling and empowering, that means that in the future they will feel able to do that. But sometimes we go and advocate for people. Now, when we're doing all of this, if we're talking to all these people, we're listening to all their problems, we're hearing about how their careers work, we get a lot of information. We learn about systems. We learn what works well, badly. And we can help some. And then if we get somebody else who comes along with the same problem, and then someone else comes along with the same problem, we can help them. At some point, we have to think, why is everybody coming to me with the same problem? And is there anything I can do about it? First thing that you can do is to tell people, to tell somebody who's involved with that. That's just the idea of feeding back. So you've been sitting and you've been working with clients, and every one of them says, I'd love to take a course. I really want to develop my skills. I really want to get better at this. I want to better myself. But the benefit system won't allow me to do that. It says if I go to college for more than a certain number of hours a week, I can't still get my benefits. And then I can't feed myself. I can't feed my kids. So that's not going to work for me. And you've got this frustrating thing where you've got this person and they've an idea about how to move their life forward, and they've got some barrier that's standing in their way that you can't easily help them to get round. So what do? Well, you can feed back so you can go to the benefit system, you can go to the benefit office, and you can say, we keep getting these problems. Is there any way we can change the rules? Is there any flex? Even actually understood it right? And so you can feed back into the system and try and change it. And then ultimately, we've also this role of developing systems. So we start to see, okay, there's something going wrong here. Perhaps we can do something about that. I can go in and advocate for it. And the point here is that you might be doing something at that stage which is not about working with an individual. You might have seen a problem that your organization or your university or your school or your employment office is having the same problem over and over again, and you decide, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to people and I'm going to try and change it. And if necessary, I'm going to go out and I'm going to knock on doors, or I'm going to write to a politician, or whatever it is that you think will make it change. And the point is that even at that stage, when you're doing something which doesn't feel like what we think of when we think of career guidance or career development, you can still be being a career development person. You can career development practice. So this was this framework that was set up, 30 years ago, and a lot of it's been forgotten, I think, and often people focus on a much more limited range of practice. So they talk about counseling, maybe information provision, sometimes careers education. But these wider sort of systemic changes that you can do, often we don't theorize them very well. And we've all done all of these things, and certainly different types of practitioners will do these kinds of things all the time. So I'm being photographed as we go, so it's quite a strange experience. Anyway, what I wanted to do at that stage was to get you to just have a bit of a think about your practice. So what I'd like people to do, and I don't know if we can move, let's move people in the Zoom or the Hoover group into small groups and just your practice. So introduce yourself, what is it you do? And if you look at these kinds of areas, what kind are you informing and advising mainly, or are you really involved in, or are you actually actually about it? There are things that I do which are about changing systems. They're about changing, so for example, I might find that a lot of kids in my school can't take the subject options that they want. And they find that really frustrating because that's going to limit their career in the long run. Perhaps they can't do chemistry at the same, because it's being scheduled at the same time as computer science. And people say, well, no, that's wrong, because I want to do something that has both of those subjects in it. So do is you can go and talk to the head teacher. You can try and get the timetable changed. You can think about what other classes can be put on. You're working as a system change person at that point, but you're also doing career development. So let's move you into breakout rooms, and in the room, if you just kind of turn to the person who's next to you, we'll just take 5 minutes for you to talk and say, you know, which of these are you using? The point I'm trying to make here, career guidance, when it's done well, it's about helping people, but helping people is not always as simple as it looks, because helping people can one-to-one, just giving at the most simple level, just give people some information, they want to know it, they go off and do what they wanted to do. But sometimes it involves getting into their psychology, digging down, doing some deep work with them. But sometimes you also come up against some barriers. The barriers of other people, the barriers of society, the barriers of organizations. And we have to think, we also need to have some influence over those things. So when we're doing career guidance, we're trying to have an effect over the world, but we're trying to help people to move their careers forward and to find the best way to do that. And at the heart of what we're calling the social justice approach is really trying to give career counselors or career guidance professionals permission to do more things, to try more things out, if that's what's going to help people most. So some of you may know the name, some of you may have met in the past. He was a great mentor to me, and he was a giant of the career development field for about 50 years, retired in, I think, like that. And I still meet him for lunch every few months, and he tells me all the things, but none of them to do with career development anymore. So he made a very, very smart observation. This is back in the 1990s, he said this. He says, career education and guidance is a profoundly political process. You might not have thought of it as that. You might have thought, well, I'm not really that interested in politics. That's not really what I'm trying to do. Leave that to the politicians. I'm trying to do career counseling. I want to help. He said, no, because it operates at the interface between the individual and society, between the self and opportunity, aspirationalism. So what he means by that is you can't just think yourself into a better career. If you want to have a better career, you also then have to go out and do something about it. And that involves interacting with other people. That involves trying to get a job, trying to get promoted, and so on. We're interacting with other people and with organizations. We're doing that on a terrain that is set by our society, by the economy, and so on, by politics, ultimately. So if a society in which life chance unequally distributed, we face the issue as to whether we try and reinforce those unequal distributions or whether we try to reduce them. So if we accept the idea that career is not just the expression of our mind, of our personality, but it's also our interaction with the world, we hit the world, and the world is not fair. And we have to, as we hit the world, we realize it's not fair, to think, what do we do about that? And we can do a range of different things. And Tony goes on to say, well, what can we do? Well, the first thing we can think about is, are we mainly about helping the individual, or are we mainly about helping society? Is the purpose of what we do mainly about helping the individual or mainly about helping society? And I would say that everybody, the answer is somewhere in between, right? Everybody, the answer is somewhere in between. But obviously it depends where you go on that line. And the other thing is, are we trying to get change, or are we trying to keep things the same? And if we ask ourselves two questions, what divide way people do guidance into 4 categories. So our first, and these are not the names of, they're sort of what he calls guidance. So the first one, he's be conservative. Well, they are people who are trying to do something. What they're trying to do is to basically keep things jobs, finding best place and everybody in place, right? So it's the idea that you're finding out where people fit and you're just helping them to get into that. You want society to work well. You want things to be efficient. So when politicians stand up and they say, we want more people to go into science jobs, that's that kind of perspective, right? We're trying to do career guidance in a way that encourages people to consider things that are perhaps in the interest of society. Trying to change society, we're just trying to make everything work well. Right, if you focus on the individual and you're not really interested in changing things, then it's what you might call a liberal perspective. So you're saying, well, look, what we're trying to do, I want to talk to you. I want to know what you want to do. What do you want to do with your life? Okay, you want to be a train driver. Great. Okay, well, how do we help you become a train driver? So you could argue that like Carl Rogers, that person-centered counseling has a lot of this in it. It says all of the answers are in the individual. It's not about changing the individual. It's not about convincing them to do something they hadn't thought of. It's about helping people to find out what they want to do. So it's on helping them to achieve what they want. We're not really trying to change them. All right, well, if we would say, well, actually, what about, we do want to change people a little bit. We want to push them. We want to say, actually, do you know what? No one in your family has ever been to university, but you're super clever. You should perhaps think about it. And the person says, oh, no, it's not for me. It's not for me. And you say, no, seriously, you should think about it. You've got all of the things that would get you into a university. Or into a different kind of job than your family have done. So this is what Tony calls the progressive approach. What we're trying to do, raise people's aspirations, widen their horizons, give them new things that they perhaps hadn't thought of, change them. But we're really focused on the individual. We're not saying we want to change the society, change the world, but we want some people who we feel would be better placed. We want to give them encouragement, we want to support them, but we also want to challenge them and stretch their possible. And then what about if you think, well, actually, I want to change things, but I also am quite focused on society. I recognize that there are problems in my society that aren't very easy for just an individual to overcome on their own. Perhaps we need to change the structures in society. We need to reorganize things a bit. I gave you some examples when we were talking about the so on that are quite low, they're quite local. So your school's not very well organized and you can help to do that. But what about if it's your whole society that's not very well organized? What if the society is really unequal and people can't, not everybody can have a great life through just being a clever career manager? Perhaps you need to change things. You need to try and make things more equal. Well, should we be talking about those kinds of things? Well, Tony says that the people who do that, we might call them the sort of radical career counselors. So we've got perspective, different ways we can think about it. And what we're trying to do in this social justice perspective, I suppose first, before we get into kind of arguing that we're going to try and push you in one particular direction, and I guess really we're trying to push you into the change half of this diagram. So helping individuals to achieve more, but also helping societies to change, seeing guns in that. More importantly than that, we're trying to get practitioners and theorists and so on to think about the implications of the kinds of theories and approaches that they're using. So that's what we're trying to do, sort of critical perspectives. So we're going to have another quick breakout now, and we're going to say, you know, do you buy this? Do you accept this idea that actually what you're doing in career counselling, or in career guidance, or in career development work is facilitating the allocation of life chances? You're helping people to get chances that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't have done. And if so, how do you feel that society which is unequal? And we all do, to some extent. So, and does that push you in one direction or another? So we'll break out again, 5 minutes. If people put questions, when we come back from this, I'll just take a couple of questions at the end of, when we come back from the break, just to break it up a bit as well and see what people are asking about. So yeah, if we take another, maybe slightly long, maybe six or 7 minutes for this one. And again, group together, the online participants. So what I thought I'd do is I'll just, I'll take a couple of the online questions now, and then I'll perhaps see if there's any more questions or comments in the room. So do you want to ask a question?
What are the origins of social justice in career development theories? Who were the top theorists in the past, and how were social movements defined then and now?
Okay, so we've got a question here which is asking sort of, where does this all come from? What are the origins of it? So what we've written about this, but I think one of the ways that career development has tended to be divided in the past has been between a sort of sociological perspective, sometimes called structuralism, and a more sort of psychological perspective. And the problem with a lot of the sociological perspective, which a lot of this draws on, is that it was very defeatist. It was very much, there are structures in society, there's not a lot you can do about them. If you're going to try and understand how careers work, then it's very helpful to understand that there are a lot of structures. So, you know, this will be different in each country, but in many countries, for example, if we look at the structure of gender, we find out that women often have different educational opportunities, have different careers, even in countries like, I mean, I work quite a lot in the Nordic countries, which are supposed to be the most equal societies on earth, and yet you look at their labor market and there are definitely girls' jobs and boys' jobs, right? So if we think about it like that, we get a tradition in career development theory which says there are these big structures and they explain a lot about how our careers work. And I find that quite persuasive, but I also find it a bit depressing because it doesn't really tell us what we can do about it. And what a lot of the more psychological theories or certainly some of them have often focused on is, what can you do? Like if we think about life design, for example, it encourages agency. It really encourages people to say, you can take control of your life. What I think we're trying to do in these social justice perspectives is to recognize this sort of truth about how societies are structured and how that structures our careers, but also to say that's not the end of the story. We need to give people something that they can do about it. And so I think what we're trying to do is to bring that together. And now we're drawing on, there are lots of theorists, but not all necessarily confined to careers. So particularly people like Paulo Freire from Brazil, who's a radical educator from sort of 1970s, 60s and 70s. We draw on him. We draw on a number of different critical theory traditions. But I think if we think about the career development literature, then what we're trying to do, I think, is to recognize some of the truths that are in the sociological tradition, but to assert the agency that's asserted in the more psychological tradition. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but hopefully it gives some sort of sense of how we've tried to square, we're not claiming at all that this comes out of nothing.
At what age level, grade level, do you believe that the right time to start with the social justice?
Yeah, I think career development is, if we're thinking about age here, I think your career starts when you're born and it goes until you die, and probably some people would say it goes beyond then. So, and there are really important career decisions to be made all the way along. And I certainly think we should be doing more career development work with young children, and in kindergarten, in primary schools, so in the early grades and so on. Why do I think that's important? Well, partly because those young people are moving, they're going to have a career, they're moving towards a sort of career. In fact, they're actually already going through a career. They're making decisions every day about how to spend time, how to organize their life, and so on. They're making them at the early parts of their life very much in partnership with their parents and with their teachers and so on. But having career development conversations is important just for that reason. But it's also important for another reason, which is very strongly related to social justice, which is what we know is that people's occupational and career identities become very fixed early on. By the time this will again be different in different school systems, different countries, different cultures, but certainly a lot of the evidence I've seen suggests that by the time a young person is 12, 13, 14, they've already ruled out lots of things that they possibly could have considered. They've decided what they might do and what they're interested in, what they think is ridiculous they definitely wouldn't do. They've also done a lot of work thinking about what is a girl's job and a boy's job, and what is a high status job and a low status job. So if we're going to influence those kind of fundamental ideas, we're going to have to get to people young. And so we're going to have to start talking about careers young. Now, I don't think you necessarily need a very, very active social justice perspective in that, other than just that we should start talking. We should start engaging young people from the ages of 3, 4, 5 in finding out about the world and recognizing that there are lots of jobs, and asking their parents, grandparents what they do, and encouraging a form of career development learning where people start to expand their horizons rather than contract them. So what we should be doing most, I think, in primary schools is trying to avoid that narrowing that tends to happen, and to keep people thinking, oh, actually, maybe men do become nurses, maybe women do become mechanics. And so to try and keep people broad, to keep everything in play until people are a bit older. So these are some of the things I think we could think about. Okay, I'm going to go on a little bit, and then we'll perhaps take a couple of questions in a second. So let's think about considering justice and injustice. Well, I've said this already. The idea that life isn't fair is a pretty obvious one. And in the way it's so obvious that it's not worth doing. But if we look at the lives of these two people, so one, I think he's in Sweden actually, and then the other is a motorcycle courier carrying far too much of his motorbike, and he's I think in Brazil. So we've got the lives of those two people are very different, and one of them is a better career manager than the other, and they're not just different because one of them was more occupationally suited to one occupation than another. They're different because the streets they live are quite different. So I'll skip here, but we perhaps should be thinking these questions about, life fair? What are the things that get in the way? Why with rewards? Why are the most talented people not always in the most senior or most influential positions? Why do some people starve while others live in abundance? And what you think is there's not one answer to these. The whole of politics and philosophy is essentially devoted to answering these questions. Career development's not going to come along and answer them, but we should be thinking about them as we're trying to think about how we support and help people best. So there are a series of ideas that, in the perspective we've sort of advanced, we've found particularly helpful in thinking about the answers to some of these questions. Again, you don't have to agree with all of them, but I'm going to explain what these ideas are and why we found them to be helpful. So the ideas are power, responsibilization, and intersectionality. So let's start with power. So the argument here is career deals with power and power at the heart of what career is about. And, you know, the most obvious example of that is my boss, in fact, more than once a year, she gets to decide a good boy or not, and I've done well in my work, and whether ultimately I get a pay rise or not. I never get the chance to say whether she's done well. Nobody ever asks me, do you think she's doing a good job? So that's a power imbalance. Same thing, you go for a job interview. The interviewer asks you a whole load of questions. They get to decide whether you get the job or not. Obviously, you can decide not to take the job. It is a two-way street there, but the power balance is definitely on one side or the other. So all of these processes, both in education and employment, that we face through career are unequal power relations. And what we actually talk to people about, when we talk about career management, often what we're talking about is helping people to navigate those situations and to do their best, to find ways to negotiate with power and to find ways to advance themselves in the best way they can. And that's a great thing. That's what career development venture do, is help people to understand that world, understand what power they have, understand what power they work in that reality. Successful careering then involves thinking about who has power and who doesn't. The market work, how do you progress in an occupation, who are the decision makers? Asking what power's being used for. So this starts to bring in some more dimensions. What's a good company for? Doing in the world? Is good, you know, are they a good employer? Will they give me good pay? Will they give me holiday? Are they a good company in that? Are they destroying the planet? Are they exploiting people? Are they, you know, doing something really wonderful? We ask these questions. Thinking about how you can increase your power. This is what a lot of career development is about. It's normally framed in this way, but thinking about getting a job, increasing your influence, working with others to do so. This is a lot of what we're doing in career development. The idea of power is quite a useful analytical tool for thinking about career. The second idea is the idea of neoliberalism, and a bit of a kind of difficult word because lots of people mean different things by it. We use it for is to try and describe the society in which we live and to recognize that it is a global society in which there is a set of political assumptions. That's not to say that every country operates on the same ideas. Of course they don't. What liberalism does is it provides a sort of overarching framework for global governance, and that things like the regulation of global labor markets, free movement, these sorts of things. So neoliberalism typically places a lot of power in the hands of corporations and markets. It also has an important role for governments in doing that. So when we're thinking about neoliberalism, we're paying attention to what big corporations, what money is doing, and what government is doing. It exists across the world. It manifests differently in different places. but it's an interconnected system. So my Nordic friends might sit feeling very happy that they have a very equal society, but they're still eating food that's grown in low-income countries. They're still buying products that are made in China and so on. So their system of government is dependent, their economy is dependent on the rest of the world. The other thing about neoliberalism is it's not an absolute deal. There's lots of people disagree with it. Lots of people say, I don't like the way they're doing that. And some of them are in governments in different countries. And so we're always in a negotiation, but we would probably say since the late 1970s, neoliberalism has had the upper hand. It's been the kind of main, and politics is run. And if you look like in any country, well, it will be different in country, but key things might be downsizing the public sector, so saying we can't afford as much education, as much healthcare, of state kinds of policies. So what has all this sort of big politics got to do with, had something to do with career development, is these logics that we get in the neoliberal of the idea that, you know, we should be working hard, the market will give the best outcome, and so on. These get into our minds, into our brains. So we have an idea which we call responsibilization. What do we mean by that? Well, let's start with a sort of fairly typical career development sort of idea. So this is a poster that I've seen in careers, or things like this, at least in careers offices all over the world. So this poster says, quote, it's got a nice, inspiring background. It says, you can be anything you want to be if only you believe with sufficient conviction and act in accordance with faith. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. So this is a very empowering statement. It's the kind of guidance professionals might say to clients. You've got to believe, you've got to work hard. And those ideas of self-belief, self-efficacy, hard work, resilience, these kinds of things, full ideas, and they are good strategies for developing a career. You can't deny that they're effective strategies. They absolutely are. But there's a danger in them. And the danger is that at some point you tip over from saying you can do anything you want to do into saying it's your fault if you haven't been successful. And start into a world where if you work hard, then you will do well. And we've already said we know that's not completely true. We know the world's not fair. Doesn't mean it's a good idea to work hard, but limit to how far we can get. So the problem with this idea is that we move from a position where we focus on self-empowerment to a position where it's very easy for somebody who isn't doing well to turn that into a blame game. And what we've seen is that we've got power imbalances, we've got a world that's not fair. That's not just an accident. There's a political system, there's books written on it and so on, which we've described as neoliberalism, that means that there is inequality. And so some people are going to not do well. And if we just say it's not because you didn't try hard enough, then it's pretty dangerous for people. So we try and we worry about this idea of responsibilization. So neoliberalism then is not just political and economic forces acting on us. It's ideas that we internalize within ourselves. And when we're doing career counseling, or when we're working with people in groups, we have to recognize that they're internalizing these logics. They're internalizing the idea that we need to work hard, and if we work hard, then we will get our rewards. And if we didn't work hard, then that's the reason why we've not been successful. And then we look at Donald Trump, and I'm not picking on him particularly, there's any number of millionaires and billionaires we could pick up. And, you know, Donald Trump is just funnier, basically, because with Donald Trump, the people have worked out that if he had never made a business deal in his whole life and just put the money that his father left him in the bank, he would be just as rich now as he was then. You know, it's not to say that there isn't entrepreneurs and businessmen who've become incredibly wealthy through their own brilliance. There's also a lot who haven't done it through that way. So we have to be aware that we need to help people to recognize their position in society and not just to push all of the responsibility onto them. And this gets into another couple of key concepts that we get in career development, which is the ideas of resilience and adaptability. So the idea that we should bounce back and we should adapt. These are, as I said, these are powerful strategies, but there's a danger with them, again, that they tell people that it's always your fault, it's always up to you to solve all the problems. And there's a really good writer in Denmark, he says, actually, we've got to be careful about all of this stuff. Sometimes when people tell us to change, sometimes when the world changes around us, sometimes when things go wrong, we're better to just say, no, I don't really agree with that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand firm. That's his phrase. I'm going to stand firm because there might be things that are valuable that I believe in. And the important thing here is change is not always good in and of itself. It might be good. You might need to adapt to it. You might need to be resilient, but in and of itself, it's not good. So we need to try and get some kind of perspective on what the changes we're being asked to make and decide our strategies in response to them. So if we want another illustration of the way these neoliberal logics sort of get inside our mind, we can see the sort of this postcard, which is actually a postcard I bought the first day I went to university, and I'm still presenting it 30 years later, because I don't think I really understood it then because I hadn't really been to work. But what this postcard says, it's a series of rats and they're running around a maze, and what they're told is work harder, earn more money, buy more things, and then keep going. And what you realize when you look at it for long enough is they're running around in a square and they're never getting to happiness. All they're doing is going round and round in a circle, being told that what makes you happy is working harder, buying more things, consuming. But equally, in a career sense, it's getting promoted, getting to the top of the tree. And we're not to say that these things are not going to make people happy, but we've got to try and sometimes question this. Because if all we do is sort of constantly accelerate people, responsibilize people and accelerate people, then there's a very big danger that we're actually making things worse for them, even if in the short term we help them to get a job. Our final thought is of this of these four things was this idea of intersectionality, and I suppose where it starts from is a lot of what I've been talking about so far is all about economic relations. It's all about people are poorer or they're richer, they're more powerful, they're less powerful. But obviously we're not reducible entirely to economic to economics. So what else is there? Well, there's this idea of intersectionality, which says, actually, the way the world works is very complicated. There are lots and lots of different hierarchies and different features and different elements of our personality. And none of us are just one thing or another. None of us are just rich or poor. None of us are just a woman or a man. None of us are just black or white. None of us are just settled community or a migrant. We're a mix of all of these things. We mix all of them together. And so when we start to think about people and talk about people, we need to recognize that people are very diverse. There's a lot of different experiences out there. But those experiences also come with hierarchies. And this wheel of power and privilege is a kind of good summary of it, that, you know, you kind of know how it works in most cases. So in this one, being in the middle is basically you're going to have an easier life. So if you're rich and you own property and you're slim and you're robust and you're neurotypical and so on, you're going to have an easier life than if you're poor and homeless and you've got a large body size and you're mentally vulnerable and so on. Obvious, but we need to think about these things. And sometimes people who present with some features of privilege have other areas where they're not so privileged. And so one of the things we're trying to do when we're doing any kind of careers work with people is to recognize the diversity of people, recognize the plurality, respond to these different experiences that people have. What I will let's just take 5 minutes. And again, I just want you to look at these questions and talk and try and think of real individuals who you've talked to who might have had one of these experiences. So the experiences are, well, have you ever seen a client or a student who felt that they were not paid enough, or that they had to work too hard? Have you ever seen a client or a student who's complained that they were being pushed to the edges of their organization or to their life? Who perceived that others were always telling them what to do? Who felt that they couldn't be themselves and that others were trying to change them? That they'd experienced harassment, bullying, or violence? Just think about that person and share with the people you're talking with. How did you help them? What did you do? And was there anything else you could have done, thinking back? What I'll do now is, perhaps Marilyn, I don't know whether you want to give, perhaps if we take another couple of questions and then,
Yes.
then kind of move on and finish up with some of the more ideas for practice.
One of the questions says there are parts of the Asia Pacific region where talking about social justice is politically risky. Do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is the case, I think, in lots of environments. It's not, and so I think people have to make their own judgments. We're not sort of saying this is an absolute method. I'm going to show you some sort of approaches, and some of them I think you don't necessarily have to use the language of social justice. Some of them are not, you don't necessarily have to explicitly address some of these ideas that I've talked about, like neoliberalism and so on. But what we're trying to do is to give you some tools that you can push things as far as you think is appropriate. Some of them are not explicitly, in fact, most of them I would say are not explicitly political in a sense, but they sometimes will have political implications. And in many countries where we have repressive regimes, or where we have a lack of ability to discuss political issues and so on, it's not to say that those things don't impinge on people's careers. So clients will raise them, clients will talk about things, and helping them to find some kind of explanation for what's happening to them seems to me important as much as you can do it. So yeah, I totally recognize that. And the point is not to kind of run out and start, waving a flag or whatever immediately with everything. I think we're trying to look for ways that we can push things, recognize some of the structures and work around them. And you will know best in your locality what's the way to do that. Can we take one more?
One more question is, can you talk about how to apply social justice when you're working with people who are focused on digital, the digital generation, okay?
Yeah, we've been trying to think about this quite a lot, and so we in Norway we've been developing an approach which we've been calling integrated guidance, which is really trying to make best use of the digital world. And I mean, I can talk more about that at another time, but I think what at the heart of that is the idea that we do not live a digital or a physical life. increasingly people live a blended life which blends the two together, especially younger generations. I mean, you know, if you only need to see me shouting at my children about how they're using their phones while they're sitting at the dinner table, for them to retort that so am I. And, you know, but the point is, the digital world is not separate, but there are opportunities for careering in the digital world. And there are also opportunities for the exercise of power and inequality in the digital world. And we need to think about those things. We need to think, I mean, often we assume that the digital world is a sort of naturally occurring phenomenon, when of course it isn't. And I think one of the things that we can do in careers education is help people to understand what is the internet? You know, who owns it? What are the different platforms? How does it work? If I go onto LinkedIn, for example, and I'm looking for jobs, how are employers using it? So we're trying to demystify this digital world and also look at where it overlaps and intersects with people's physical world. And I think increasingly it's not, for many, many people, especially for younger people, it's not very helpful to think about digital on one hand and physical on the other. We need to kind of think about both of those as a blended experience. And for us, that presents some big challenges, because it also means that we have to think about new ways of delivering our services which are relevant to that, and which mean that we do, you know, offer services online that we perhaps previously wouldn't have done, and so on. But yeah, so I think that's a very important area to consider. All right, I'm going to just give you a few examples to try and hopefully crystallize what I'm talking about. So I've sort of focused really on critique and so on so far, rather than to think about solutions. So we realized that was a problem, and so we've tried to come up with something that's a kind of practical framework. So, you know, the question really is, can career guidance make a difference? If you start talking about all of this stuff, you know, we've just been talking about people who are living in repressive regimes where they can't necessarily even articulate themselves about things that they think. Can something as kind of simple and small as career guidance really have an effect on these things? Well, I think we need to be careful not to have too much hubris. We can't pretend that career guidance is the thing that's going to solve all the world's problems, but hopefully it can be part of a wider set of educational activities which can hopefully move us forwards. So what we've developed is a framework that we call the 5 signposts towards socially just career guidance. So the idea of the signpost is important. We're not saying this is what you should do, because in each of your contexts, that's going to be different. We're not even saying you have to do all of these things necessarily. But what we are saying is that there are some general principles that we found when people start to talk about social justice in relation to career guidance. There are certain things that they typically do. And we've tried to distill them down into these 5 signposts. So I'm going to go through them one by one and explain what they are. So they build critical consciousness, name oppression, question what's normal, encourage people to work together, and work at a range of levels. And I think when we go through these, you'll see why many of them are possible to do, even if you feel like you don't want to be sort of explicitly talking about social justice with people. So our first one is the idea of critical consciousness. And we draw on this on Paulo Freire. And what we're trying to do with critical consciousness is basically about understanding the world. It's not that different from what we might talk about in career guidance as learning about the labor market. But in critical consciousness, we start to notice some of those things that I've talked about already: power inequalities, you know, the political systems, the intersectionalities, the elements of your identity. We start to try and give people a language and a way of understanding the world that helps them to demystify how things work. So our central question here is in whose interest does this work? So we're not just trying to understand the world, we're also trying to ask, why is it like that? And that's, I think, a question that career guidance has often been weak at asking. So we're often told there's a lot of change, the labour market's getting faster, we're going to have automation. I'm going to talk about some of these things tomorrow in my keynote. But very few people stand back and say, well, why is that happening? And in whose interest is it? And the other thing that we want our clients to do is to consider what can be changed and how. We ask that question. So, okay, how are things structured? Why are they structured that way? And then, can any of this be changed? Is it natural? Is this the only way things can be? And sometimes the answer to that will be yes, or at least it will be, it's going to be very, very difficult to change this. But in other examples, it might not be the case. And often I think we become far too sure that things are the same and always will be the same very, very quickly. So assumptions about how organizations work, how countries work and so on, get internalized very quickly. And we forget that it was ever any different. And yet something comes along, COVID is a good example, but before, you don't need to go very far before that. You look at the economic crash that much of the world experienced in 2008, big changes to lots and lots of systems. COVID comes along, even bigger changes. We're now talking about net zero. That'll be an even bigger change. So all of the things that we thought could never change, they keep changing, and they change like over quite short periods of time. So what do you do with this? Well, I'm going to try and give you a quick example of practice from each of these. So this is an example from a friend and colleague of mine, Anne Delzon. She works at the University of Reading in the UK. And she took this idea of how do we build critical consciousness in our students. And she was doing lots of career development work with students and trying to get them to think about the labour market and learn about what jobs were out there. And so she decided she wanted to do something that was looking at the gender pay gap. She said lots of female students had come to her and they talked about this, how can I avoid it? And so she said, let's do a workshop where we actually talk about this. Let's talk about the gender pay gap. And so she did that. And then and there's a workshop, you can download the workshop if you want to. But what she did, she showed him a video, which talks about, basically sets out the facts. You know, there is a gender pay gap. This is how it works. Here's some of it works through women working in some industries, those industries typically being paid less than the ones where men are dominated, and there are various other factors. Goes through the facts. And then she, rather than just saying, okay, well, that's it, you've learned it, she got the students to discuss. And she gives them different possibilities. Okay, well, you could respond to it like this, or you could respond to it like this, or you could respond to it like this. Which is the best response? So she's trying to get people to think about structural issues and to think of a way around it and to consider a range of different possible solutions. So in this workshop, this is an attempt to do this kind of critical consciousness building. So our second signpost we call it naming oppression. And we've got a really nice framework from Iris Marion Young where she says, what is oppression? Well, it's basically those questions that I gave you just when we went into the last break. So it's when people feel exploited, when they feel marginalized, when they feel powerless, when they feel what she calls cultural imperialism, which is basically other people putting their values onto you when you don't really agree with them. And when you actually experience violence, and that can be physical violence, but it also can be mental or psychological violence. So naming oppression is simple. All we're saying when we're naming oppression is that we will just notice when those things happen. We won't try and diminish it. If you're talking to someone and they're talking about a problem they've had, you might even go as far as suggesting, well, mate, do you think that's sexism? Do you think that's racism? And they might say, no, it's not that. It's something else. He's just a horrible man. He's horrible to everyone equally. But explore those things with them. But particularly when somebody discloses, I've experienced some kind of oppression. Give them time to talk about it. Give them time to think about it and explore what can be done about it. So in career counseling, what we try and do is to help our clients to understand where their experiences are examples of oppression, to challenge their self-blaming behaviors, which is what many, many people will do, especially people who are oppressed will do. Oh no, it wasn't, there was nothing that they were doing wrong, it's just that I'm stupid. And I think our job is to say, well, are you sure about that? You know, you seem very clever, very capable here. Why is it in that environment you seem, you know, and people will often say things, well, I'm just very shy, I don't ever put myself forward. These are self-blaming experiences or self-blaming behaviors that we should be challenging. So we might suggest possible names for the things they're feeling and experiencing. We might encourage them to consider how recognizing this oppression reshapes their experience, and to think about what they can do about it now. So if you think you're doing badly in your job because you're bad at your job, that is a very different problem than if you think you're doing badly at your job because you're being bullied by a nasty manager. Those are two different problems, and they have two very different solutions. And what, you know, thinking about that, if we can get to that, we get somewhere closer to what the problem is. So I did some work with a group which is called the Institute of Student Employers in the UK, and it's mainly an employer association. And after the Black Lives Matter protests that started in America but came to Europe and so on as well, a lot of employers felt suddenly very concerned about what they were doing and whether they were actually being more prejudiced than they thought. So we did a project and we looked at what employers could do, and we looked at what careers services in universities mainly, we did talk to some schools as well, could do. And we came together and we found that there were a lot of different solutions here, but the first step for all of them was recognizing that there was an issue. Recognizing that actually there were things about their recruitment processes, for example, or there were things about the way in which they ran their careers service, which they did not, I mean, in almost all cases, they did not intend to be racist. They did not intend to discriminate. But when they looked at it and when they reflected on it, they thought, actually, there might be something in what we're doing that isn't right. And so naming it, recognizing it, and then that gave them the ability to start coming up with some sort of solution. Okay, our third one then is to question what's normal. So in our societies, we've got two very abnormal looking people up there. I don't know whether every country has this subculture, but in Britain we have, they call themselves goths, and they're people who like to dress in a lot of black, sometimes wear a lot of quite extreme makeup and hair. And I put them up because it asks us a question, is if somebody like that came in to see you as a career counselor and said, I'm going to work, I want to work in an accountancy company, you might want to talk to them about how they dress. But why? Why would we want to do that? Because there's no reason to think that those two are not absolutely excellent accountants. Their accountancy knowledge might be second to none. So why is it? Well, I think actually it is important to talk about that, because what we're doing when we're having that conversation is we're recognizing that there are some norms, there are some sort of basic ways in which society is organized that people are expecting. When you go for a job in an accountancy firm, you're going to put on a suit and tie, if you're in England at least, and you're then going to behave in a certain way. You're going to dress quite conservatively and so on. And that's important information for people to have. People need to understand the norms. And society, I'm not against norms. Societies need norms. If we don't have any norms, we can't do anything. Every day, you know, I come out of my door and decide, am I going to cartwheel down the road or am I going to hop to work today? No, there are norms, and many of them are there for good reasons, but and they're also there because we need some way to organize society. But they are not impossible to think about. So a very common norm is that there are certain jobs, I've talked about this a few times, there are certain jobs that women tend to go into and there are certain jobs that men tend to go into. That is a norm. It's not talked about, it's assumed, it's understood, but it is not something that has to be there, and it's something that is worthy of reflecting on and considering. So what we are saying in this is question what's normal. It doesn't mean reject it, but there might be things that people think are normal, which is worth them thinking about more. So that might include things like, what constitutes a good career? What's a successful career? Is it one where you earn a lot of money? Is it one where you are famous? Is it one where you get home at 5 o'clock every day and see your kids? You know, what is a successful career? There are norms which regulate how people behave, but they're worthy of question. They're worthy of discussion. So we in this one, we try and talk about it. Now, in Sweden, they have really got interested in this idea of norm criticism, and they've really developed a lot of interventions in schools, which are really encouraging people to think about some fundamental things within their life. Now, again, this will be different for every different country. But if we think about Sweden, it's a country where they really prize equality as being very, very important, but it's a country where there are actually very big inequalities in the way that the labour market is organised. And so they really wanted to take that on. So what they're trying to do is encourage students to think about the norms and their assumptions. And they're about gender, they're about sexuality, they're about family type. What kind of, is it best to have, 2 parents and 2 children, or are there other types of family? And encouraging them to think about that, and particularly in the context of career, to think about how they interact with career. And, one of the examples that Frida, who wrote a lot about this, Frida Wickstrand, she talked about an example of a career counsellor who was really challenging a young woman who was thinking about going into a career in baking. And the reason she was challenging her was because baking has very unsociable hours. You have to get up incredibly early in the morning, you finish work very early, and then you have to go to bed. So it's effectively night work. And she was saying, well, do you really want to do that? Won't it make it very difficult for you to have a family? Won't it make it very difficult for you to find a husband, and so on? And she didn't say at any point, do you want a family? Do you want a husband? So there was a sense in which the counsellor was imposing norms on people rather than questioning them and challenging them. Then our fourth one is to encourage people to work together. And I've sort of touched on this already, but career is not an individual activity. You can't have a career on your own. Even people who say that they work alone, you never work entirely on your own. But most of us, we work in organizations, we're part of families, we're in friendship groups, we have gain a lot of strength in our careers from our colleagues and co-workers. And so what this one says is really encourage people to think about the resources that they have around them, the people who are around them. So it's not just about thinking about you and where do you fit in, but also like who can help you. And with that comes an expectation of reciprocity. Not only can you ask people to help you, you also need to help them as well. So we recognize that careers are collective, they're social, they're not just individual. And we also recognize that there are lots of times when there might be collective struggles as well as individual struggles. So sometimes our chance of getting a pay rise is much better if we come together and convince the organization to give it to us as a whole staff group than if we try and get promoted as an individual. Sometimes that's not the case as well. So, well, I'll just tell you another example before I get onto this example. So Ria, my colleague, she does, in her career guidance in community, one of the things that she describes, which is very simple, but is really powerful, I think, is you see a student and they come to you and they have a problem. And then you see another student and they come to you with a similar problem. Now, that's really common, especially if you're in well, in any kind of context you might be practicing in, because whatever's led that first person to have that problem is probably leading someone else to have a similar problem. Well, at the moment, we try and work with these people and solve these problems for them, or work with them to solve the problem. What Ria and the counsellors that she worked with in Denmark started to do was to say, okay, I've seen 3 other students who've got the same problem as you. Would you mind if I just organise for you all to come together and just talk about it? Because we're all having the same problem, and probably we're going to come up with a solution to it more easily if there's 3 of you talking or 4 of you talking than if it's just you on your own. So she started in the high school where this study was based. They started to do this, to start, rather than just seeing people one-to-one, they started trying to club people together, join people together, give them more resources. So we start in this kind of approach, we're really encouraging people to make connections with others and come together. So I've got this example, which is an activity that I ran. So I still occasionally do bits and pieces of careers work with people, rather than just studying it. So we had a summer school for a group of PhD students. And I don't know whether anyone here has got a PhD, but if you've got a PhD, then, or if you know any PhD students, then you know that PhD students like to moan a lot. It's one of their most favorite things to do. It's a very hard thing doing a PhD. I didn't enjoy it very much, but it's very hard. And PhD students will often complain and moan about their life. And they've got some good reasons for it. So I got these people together and we said, what can we do about this? And I showed them a video, which you've got the links for all of these resources. You can access them if you want. But this was a video of, this is the General Secretary of the trade union, the academic trade union in Britain. And she does a piece, which is basically about all the things that's wrong with higher education. And I used that to stimulate them and get them thinking. And then we said, okay, let's do something about it. We sat them down in groups and we said, write a letter and we will publish these letters on our website, which you can then send them to your vice chancellors. They don't have to be a personal letter from you, but they can come from a group and say, you know, we are in that case, we're a group of European career guidance PhD students, and we would like to bring to the attention of universities the following things. And they went and they got going and they came up with all these ideas about what they wanted their career to be like, how they wanted the university to change, what they wanted the circumstances to be like, you know, and in doing that, they came up with lots and lots of practical ideas that were both, there were ideas for them individually, there were ideas for them and their immediate supervisor or the people who were teaching them, and then there were sort of bigger systems ideas. But what it helped them to do was, by talking about it collectively, they realized they were able to articulate and move away from it just being, I'm unhappy, it's a moan, I don't like it, to say, actually, these are the things that are really wrong with my life, and these are the things that we could do about them. And some of them were very reasonable things that you thought, well, actually, nobody would really object to that. We weren't asking the universities to turn themselves inside out. So that was the idea of writing an open letter as a way of sort of articulating things that were wrong, and also putting it in a way that doesn't expose an individual, but allows you to come together collectively and make a comment, and also to see where your situation is unusual. Because if everybody's experiencing it, then there's some kind of bigger problem. If it's only you and everybody else thinks what you've experienced is really weird, then you've got something particular. Might not be a problem with you. It might be a problem with you, but it might not. It might be a problem with your immediate boss or your immediate circumstances. So that collective work helps you to think about what your situation is, calibrate where you sit, generate new ideas, and also organize collectively as well as individually. Okay, then our final fifth signpost, which we call working at a range of levels. And this is probably the one that is most exposing, I suppose. I think most of the others we can do, but this is the one that starts to get us to think, do we need to go beyond the kind of territory that career guidance has normally inhabited, of the classroom and the interview room and so on, and go into other places, do some of that feeding back, some of that system change that we talked about at the beginning. But the first and most important thing is that we recognize that careers and career guidance or careers work takes place at a lot of different levels. It takes place with individuals, it takes place in groups, it takes place in classes, school classes, university classes. It takes place in whole schools, but also in families, in communities, in labor offices, trade unions, employers, associations, governments. It takes place through active citizenry. And all of those things are where people are pursuing their careers. And therefore, all of those things are places that we potentially can intervene. And they're places where career guidance can be active. And one of the things that makes me most, I suppose, sad or disappointed is that in most countries, career guidance is concentrated only in the education system, or largely in the education system. And yet, working people are having career crises and career challenges all the time. And there's very little active support for people within a workplace. So how do we deal with that? Well, what we need, I think, to think, and this is, again, comes back to some of Ria's work of thinking about career guidance in communities, or perhaps goes a bit further, is thinking about not just where it is we are based and how we deliver career guidance there, but also where could we be based, and could we work in different ways, and so on. So, I mean, a very off the top of my head kind of example of that would be if we think about, we're in a university now, we think about a university careers service. Most of what university careers services do is see students who are currently at university. And that's great, and we definitely need that, right? Students who are at university don't know what they're going to do, many of them, and they need help to figure that out. But an awful lot of students leave university and then have problems. And we don't often have a way of interacting or supporting those students. So the first plan you had a great plan, it didn't work out. So that's one way we can stretch this. We can work at a different level by working somewhere else in someone's life journey. But we can also work in other ways. So in the university, there are many things within the system of the university. We can feed back when that's not working well. You notice sometimes that all of a sudden you've got loads of students coming from one particular department. Why is that happening? Well, figure it out and talk to that department and say, can we do more with you? But also we might find that we experience situations where things are not working well with a particular employer. Well, we can feed back to that employer. We can talk to that employer. So again, what we're trying to do really is give counsellors permission to think big and to think about the problems that the students and clients that they're working with are experiencing, and to try and analyze what they can do about it. And that may not be doing what we've always done, but it may be pushing out into other directions. So, an example of this, very simple one of working at different levels, is the sort of example of choosing or changing a major. So career counsellors often help students to make choices about choosing or changing a major. And one told me that she was regularly hearing about timetable clashes and administrative difficulties, meaning that students couldn't take the subjects that they wanted. She continued to help students to manage the system and get what they could out of it, but she started to campaign with the administration to deal with the problem, the timetable clash. And this is an example of feedback and system change just in a particular institution. And I think hopefully that kind of campaigning would be perceived as helpful. You've spotted a problem. You're in a unique position where you hear things from a different perspective from, in this case, in the university, from the faculty do. So if you're in the careers service, you hear different kinds of problems. So what do you do about it? Well, you hopefully can help the institution to understand it has a problem and then do something about it. But we might go beyond that. As soon as we start to say, well, the problem's not really in our business or in our organization, it's actually outside, then we start to have to think about different ways of interacting with people. But again, pointing out the issue, challenging the issue, saying that there's a problem is often a helpful starting point. So I think what I want you to think about really is, does any of this resonate? Is any of this helpful? Does any of this take you in any new directions? Because I think one of the things that we would argue is that career guidance often moves into a lot of these territories just on its own. There's nothing new about much of this. What I think is new is that what we're trying to do is give people permission that when you're doing something that isn't sitting with a student one-to-one, you can still think, I'm still doing my job. I'm not getting distracted into something else. I'm not doing something that's extra. I don't have to do it in my evening. But actually, sometimes you can think of different ways. You have more types of practice that you can work with. And if you have a clear analysis about what you're trying to achieve and what's the problems that your students are experiencing are, then you can deploy the different techniques in a way that can actually make a difference. So I think probably let's take any questions now, as we've got about 7 minutes, I think, to finish. So I don't know whether there are any questions in the room, because we haven't really had any from you guys yet. If not, are there any, Marilyn, are there any more on the...
There's one more, but I think you've splendidly answered it already. The question relates to eliminating discrimination against all oppressed groups. That's the wording of the question, and asks what ways we can do that. And I think that's what you just talked about, and that you've actually finished that question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the reasons why we talk about oppression rather than discrimination is, I think oppression's perhaps a bigger term, and it can affect a wider range of people. So you can be oppressed, you know, even if you're like a middle-aged white man like me. You know, I might still have forms of oppression, bullying, and so on that I might experience. But I think as a career counsellor, and there's lots of stuff on this around multicultural counselling and these sorts of things. As a career counsellor, that's why I talked about the intersectionality. You want to notice the differences that people have. You want to be comfortable in talking about those things with them and recognize that those things are not all equal. And so these kinds of issues, some of these issues are more likely to happen to some people than others. But that doesn't mean it can only happen to them. So I think it's very important focus and address discrimination and address racism, sexism, and so on, but also to recognize that forms of oppression can affect any of your clients, even ones who don't necessarily present as if they have a particular characteristic that's going to lead them in that direction.
You have a new question, and that is social justice an issue across the lifespan?
Oh, across the lifespan. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think career is a lifetime endeavor. We talked about the importance of young people here already, about, you know, starting early, but the opposite is also true. We want, I think as I've said, we need more career development to be going on outside of education, in employment, but also in things like older workers. Older workers experience a lot of particular issues of discrimination and oppression, but also have particular challenges. So there are experiences that older workers have when they're thinking about, for example, when should I retire? How should I retire? We should be offering career guidance to all of these people. Now, the problem is, for most of us, we tend to be situated in one particular context and working with one particular type of client. But I think, you know, the other thing that we could talk about is, alongside all of this, I think that we also have to be advocates for career guidance itself, and to say that we need to encourage governments, organizations, educational institutions, and so on, to invest in career guidance and to make it available more widely, and to try and increase access. And I think that ultimately is what, well, OECD describe as a lifelong guidance system, or the EU describe as a lifelong guidance system. And I think that is the aspiration. And because people have challenges and issues throughout their life. All right, well, thank you so much to everyone for coming and for listening and for joining in some fast and furious breakout rooms. And hopefully you've got something out of it. I should just, as I say, I'll put these slides on my blog. I'm sure they'll be circulated with the conference as well. I've put the references, so these are really all the things that me and my immediate colleagues have written about this subject. So if you want to read more, there's lots of stuff that you can have a look at. There's also the Career Guidance for Social Justice website, which is a free resource for everybody to look at. And I'd love people to send me articles to include on it. We try and cover, sort of have short case studies really, or opinion pieces, usually just a page in length, that say, this is what you can do. There's lots of resources like slides and films and things like that you can borrow and use if you use that website. So finally, I would say this really, that I think career is our pathway through life, learning and work. And that process of making our way through life exposes inequalities, injustice, and oppression. And I think career guidance, if what we're trying to do is to help people to manage our careers, if we don't recognize these structural factors, if we don't talk about them openly, if we don't encourage people to think about them and to come up with solutions around them, then we're not really doing our job properly. So some of this gets us into this politics of careering or into an active social justice commitment. But other of it, I think, is just being good at asking open questions and having an inquiring mind and helping your students and clients to have the same, really. What I've tried to present at the end is the 5 signposts. That is supposed to be a helpful stimulus for people to develop an approach. It's, again, free. You can use it. We've written about it in a few different places, including there's an article which goes into it in a bit more detail. But use it as you wish. If in your context one of them doesn't make sense and you want to add another one, that's absolutely fine. There's not proprietary things. They're hopefully, what we were trying to do when we developed that was to take all the writing that us and our colleagues had done and sort of distill out of it some lessons that perhaps could be helpful to practice.
Thank you, Professor Huli, and thank you to our participants in Zoom and on site.